When you're stuck in an endless line, holding Form 4B in triplicate, just waiting to get a simple stamp from a completely indifferent clerk, you feel this intense, like almost personal hatred for the entire system.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You stand there thinking, this is it. This is the absolute pinnacle of human inefficiency.
Right. It feels like a very visible, very obvious disease that has just infected society. And you just want to point at the person behind the thick glass and blame them for the sheer rigidity of it all.
Which is completely natural, but when you step back and actually look at the underlying mechanics of how society organizes itself, that clear diagnosis completely falls apart.
Exactly. We're actually looking at a structural landscape that completely flips that everyday assumption on its head. And that is our mission today as we do a deep dive into a stack of writings from the Austrian school economist Ludwig von Mises.
Specifically, we're looking at his 1944 book, Bureaucracy, along with a few of its later prefaces.
Yeah. And Mises, who wrote something like 25 books, wrote this right when central planning and massive state bureaucracies were peaking globally. But the structural mechanics he exposes are, well, they're completely timeless.
They really are. And look, before we jump in, a quick caveat for you listening. These are highly politically charged arguments.
Very charged.
Yeah, they touch heavily on socialism, capitalism, and state control. So we are absolutely not here to take a political side today.
Yeah.
Our job is strictly to pull back the curtain on the underlying logic of why society is organized the way it is.
Right, like why we have such a visceral hatred for red tape and who is actually to blame for it. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the concept of the bureaucrat itself, because the word operates in a really strange way in our language.
It operates almost exclusively as a universal insult. I mean, you will never meet a single person who proudly introduces themselves at a dinner party as a bureaucrat.
Never. Could you imagine?
Right. The term is heavily loaded with this disparaging, opprobrious connotation no matter where you are in the world. It immediately implies a criticism of slow, unyielding institutions and frustrating procedures.
Which is so funny when you look at the historical context, especially with Prussia. Because we tend to think of 18th and 19th century Prussia as like the absolute paragon of authoritarian, top-down, militaristic government.
Oh, exactly.
And the king's top advisor there had this incredibly grand, intimidating title. He was the official chief privy councilor.
Which definitely carries a certain weight to it, right? Certainly a lot more than just administrator.
Right. And this advisor was immensely proud of his power. He demanded absolute reverence from the populace. He essentially felt he was infallible because he was His Majesty's mandatory, working day and night for the glory of the state.
But here's the catch. If someone had called him a bureaucrat, he would have considered it an impudent, unforgivable insult.
He would have been furious. He viewed himself as a noble civil servant, not some paper pusher.
And what's fascinating here is how Mises takes this universal emotional hatred for the word and completely neutralizes it. He says, structurally speaking, bureaucracy in itself is neither good nor bad.
It's just neutral.
Exactly. It is not a disease. It is simply a method of management. And more importantly, it is the only appropriate method for managing specific spheres of human activity, specifically fields that operate outside the realm of market prices.
Right, and I really want to break down that mechanism because it sounds completely counterintuitive when you're the one actually waiting in that endless line at the DMV.
Yeah.
So let's build a comparison to visualize this.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine I open a bakery.
Okay, a bakery.
My feedback loop for success is instantaneous and brutal. Every single day I put a product on the shelf. And if my bread is dry or it's overpriced or just not what the neighborhood wants, the bread goes stale.
The cash register stays empty.
Exactly. I operate at a loss until I eventually lose my livelihood. That profit and loss mechanism forces me to align my daily actions with the desires of the people walking through my door. I don't need a massive rule book because the market dictates my behavior.
But if we look at a police precinct or a court of law, that entire mechanism vanishes. A detective investigating a burglary isn't generating revenue. They produce abstract social goods like justice and safety.
And you simply cannot put a price tag on a crime-free street corner.
You really can't. A police department cannot sell its products on the open market to the highest bidder, or at least we desperately don't want them to.
Right, that would be terrible.
Because there is no market price for safety, you can't evaluate a police chief's success by looking at a profit and loss sheet. There is no financial bottom line to tell you if the precinct is operating efficiently.
So Without that cash register feedback loop, the government basically has to invent a substitute to keep the precinct from descending into corruption or, arbitrary power.
And that substitute is the bureaucratic rulebook. Because there is no consumer sovereignty dictating efficiency through daily spending, the state must prescribe strict regulations.
Like budgets and protocols to dictate how that police department operates.
Exactly. The police chief can't just hire 50 new officers because he feels like it. He has to follow the budget allocated by the legislature. He can't just buy a fleet of new cars. He has to submit a requisition form.
So bureaucracy is not a failure of management. It is simply the only management tool available when the profit motive is structurally absent.
Precisely.
Okay, so if we accept that government agencies need red tape to function without market prices, that still doesn't explain the sheer scale of the anger we see. I mean, American citizens aren't generally protesting the fact that a police department has a budget protocol.
No, they aren't.
The intense frustration seems to stem from administrative agencies creeping into everyday economic life.
Yeah, the primary American indictment is that the traditional democratic system, like the careful separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, is being dismantled from the inside.
The public feels that unelected bureaucrats in massive administrative agencies are usurping the power of lawmakers, basically legislating through administrative decrees.
And they are regulating the absolute minutiae of daily life. If you look at the historical examples in the source material, citizens were furious about entities like the Office of Price Administration.
Oh yeah, you had unelected clerks issuing edicts that set the specific prices of everyday items. We are talking about the price of pepper, oranges, photographic cameras.
Razor blades, neckties, and paper napkins.
It's crazy. When you look at an unelected clerk dictating what a razor blade should cost, the absurdity of the situation just fuels the citizens' anger. They point their finger directly at that clerk.
But the fundamental logic here reveals that the public is aiming their anger at the completely wrong target. The clerk is just the symptom.
Wait, really? So the bureaucrat isn't the culprit?
Not at all. The real culprit is the system of government intervention itself. It's the political trend towards substituting government control for free enterprise.
But wait, I have to push back on that framework on behalf of the listener. If an unelected agency is suddenly dictating the price of a necktie, isn't that entire system fundamentally unconstitutional?
It definitely feels that way.
Yeah, it bypasses the elected legislature. It feels entirely un-American to have a shadow branch of government making those rules.
That is the exact complaint, but the historical and legal reality is quite different. The system is not unconstitutional because Congress voluntarily and legally delegated this power.
They just handed it over.
They did. I mean, imagine the United States Congress trying to debate and set the fluctuating daily cost of oranges or paper napkins. Parliaments and Congresses are simply not designed to micromanage the economy.
That makes sense. They do not have the time or the specialized information or the agility to handle millions of daily price fluctuations.
Exactly. So the moment you abandon the market pricing mechanism, you necessitate a bureaucratic agency. Congress legally voted to allocate that power and the budget to those agencies.
I see the trap.
Yeah.
Once the government decides that controlling the price of an orange is its responsibility, they realize they are institutionally incapable of doing it themselves. So they spawn a bureau to handle the math.
Right. And furthermore, the voters still retain the ultimate power to vote those politicians out if they disagree with the interventionist system. The bureaucracy didn't seize power, it was handed power democratically.
By politicians acting on the desires of their constituents. It's so interesting how we project our historical ideals onto these administrative systems, calling them un-American.
Oh, the historical record shows a hilarious irony there.
Yeah, especially regarding the Prussians, who we universally associate with peak bureaucracy. Bureaucratism was originally considered un-Prussian, too.
It was.
Frederick II, the great king of Prussia, actually had to import hundreds of French bureaucrats to run his taxes and customs because the system didn't exist natively in Prussia. He even had to appoint a Frenchman as his postmaster general.
Which perfectly illustrates that bureaucracy is not an inherent cultural trait. It is an imported tool used to manage state intervention.
Let's shift gears here, because if government red tape is the result of state intervention, that brings up a massive critique from the other side of the political spectrum.
The progressives, or socialists, depending on the era.
Right. They point out that government isn't the only place bureaucracy thrives. If you call a massive private telecom company or an airline today, it feels exactly like calling the DMV.
It really does.
So they argue that massive corporations naturally congeal into giant, rigid bureaucracies, regardless of government policy. Here's where it gets really interesting. Is corporate red tape actually capitalism's fault?
According to Mises, no. He says it's a misdiagnosed symptom. The progressive critique argues that as capitalist enterprises grow into mammoth corporations, they suffer from absentee ownership.
Like the stockholders are completely disconnected from the daily operations.
Exactly. And the management is left to professional administrators who lack creative leadership. They claim the free market naturally evolves into an irresponsible, slow-moving managerial oligarchy.
So does Mises believe that corporate red tape is just a myth?
Not a myth, but he argues that business rigidity is absolutely not the natural evolution of capitalism. When a corporation becomes bloated and bureaucratic, it is once again caused by government meddling.
Why?
And the specific mechanism driving this calcification is often the heavy income tax.
Walk me through that, because usually we think of taxes just as a way of funding the government. How does an income tax dictate the internal management structure of a private company?
To understand the mechanism, you have to picture an ingenious newcomer entering a free market. They start small in their garage, they invent a better product, they make a profit.
And crucially, they take that profit and reinvest it entirely into expanding the business.
Yes, this relentless, compounding innovation is a massive threat to the old, established, wealthy firms. The giant corporations are forced to stay agile, to constantly innovate, and to keep their prices low.
Because if they get lazy, this newcomer will scale up and destroy them. So the threat of the agile startup is the invisible whip that keeps the massive corporation from getting bloated.
Exactly. But if the government steps in and taxes that startup's initial profits at, say, 80%,
The mechanism breaks entirely. The newcomer can no longer compound their capital.
right, they might have a brilliant idea, but the tax code strips them of the funds needed to build factories and hire a massive workforce. They are effectively frozen as a small business.
Which means the old established giants are suddenly shielded from competition. They already have their factories and their massive capital reserves. They don't need to innovate or stay agile anymore.
Because the government has essentially legislated their biggest threat out of existence, the giants can afford to settle into bureaucratic negligence.
Their monopoly position isn't a victory of the free market. It is a protected status maintained by tax policies that prevent new challengers from rising.
When you insulate a company from the threat of failure, you guarantee the rise of corporate bureaucracy.
That entirely shifts the perspective. But if bureaucracy and rigidity are not the natural state of a free market business, what is? Mises uses a very specific term for the alternative, right? Profit management.
Yes, profit management is the defining characteristic of a market economy. But to truly understand it, we have to clear up a major misconception about who is actually in charge in a capitalist system.
Because we tend to think of the billionaire CEO or the wealthy investor as the supreme boss dictating how society runs.
But they aren't the captain of the ship. They are merely the steersman. The actual ruthless bosses dictating the course are the consumers.
And the consumer is a notoriously difficult master to serve.
Oh, they are. They are not noble, rational actors honoring legacy brands. They are full of whims and fancies, they are entirely unpredictable, and they do not care a whit about a company's past merits.
A corporation could spend 50 years building a legacy, and the moment a cheaper or slightly better razor blade hits the market, the consumer will just abandon the old brand without a second thought.
Every single penny spent by a consumer is a literal vote cast in what Mises calls an economic democracy. They determine exactly what should be produced, in what quantity, and at what quality.
They basically hold the power to make poor men rich and rich men poor based entirely on their own immediate satisfaction.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this consumer voting mechanism solves one of the most complex puzzles in human society, the problem of economic calculation.
Let's build a scenario to really visualize this calculation problem. Imagine you are sitting in a centralized planning office in a totally state-run economy.
Okay, I'm the planner.
On your desk, you have a ledger showing 10 tons of raw steel, 1,000 hours of available labor, and blueprints for both a new suspension bridge and a massive fleet of agricultural tractors. How do you mathematically decide which project benefits society more?
As a central planner, you face an impossible math problem. You cannot compare the tensile strength of steel to the caloric value of the wheat those tractors might harvest.
Right, it's apples to oranges.
You have no common denominator to weigh the commute time saved by the bridge against the food produced by the tractors. Without a common unit of measurement, the planner is essentially just guessing based on their own personal priorities.
But in a market economy, price acts as that denominator. Price isn't just money changing hands. It's an incredibly dense information signal transmitting the exact desires of millions of people.
Precisely. Market prices are the only way to know if the execution of a project will yield more value than the resources it consumes.
So if consumers are willing to pay a premium for food, the price of tractors goes up, signaling to the entrepreneur that society urgently values the tractors more than the steel required to make them.
Yes. And if an entrepreneur tries to build a bridge and the tolls collected won't even cover the cost of the raw materials, that financial loss is a vital signal to stop wasting society's scarce resources.
The profit motive mathematically forces the businessman to supply what consumers want most urgently.
It really is a brilliant mechanism.
Okay, the profit motive is clearly this incredible calculating machine for satisfying consumer whims. But I have to challenge this model, because doesn't consumer sovereignty sometimes fail spectacularly?
How do you mean?
Well, what happens when the whims of the consumer directly conflict with the actual survival of the nation? The historical record in the sources brings up a very specific, glaring example, the lead-up to World War II.
Ah, the synthetic rubber crisis.
Exactly. Before the war, Britain and the United States failed to produce synthetic rubber because it simply wasn't profitable. Meanwhile, Germany, operating under a heavily controlled, totalitarian system, successfully developed a massive synthetic rubber industry.
Right, they had a huge stockpile.
So when war broke out, the Allies were caught flat-footed, without a vital military resource. Didn't the profit motive actively jeopardize national security for the U.S. and Britain by prioritizing cheap consumer goods over strategic defense?
It is a powerful criticism, and it cuts right to the heart of what a market is designed to do. But to understand what happened, we have to look at the market reality of the 1930s.
Which was what?
The cost to produce synthetic rubber was astronomically higher than simply importing natural rubber from overseas plantations. The consumers in the US and Britain, who, again, are the ultimate bosses in this economic democracy, were simply not willing to pay massive premium prices for synthetic rubber tires.
They just wanted cheap tires so they could spend their remaining income on other things like food, clothing, or entertainment.
Exactly. So the private entrepreneur's hands were tied. They can't intentionally bleed millions of dollars to build a synthetic rubber factory if the consumer actively refuses to buy the final product.
The market was accurately reflecting the fact that peacetime consumers didn't value domestic rubber production.
The market was functioning perfectly according to consumer desires. The deeper point here is about the separation of institutional duties. Mises argues that national defense is the fundamental duty of the government, not the private citizen or the individual businessman.
You cannot expect a private chemical corporation to suddenly act like the Department of Defense.
Right. Mises uses a brilliant analogy to illustrate this. Imagine a brilliant scholar writing a definitive history book.
Okay.
You would never blame that scholar for failing to spend his afternoons doing infantry drills to prepare for the military expeditionary force.
No, of course not.
His societal role is to be a scholar. The businessman's societal role is to serve the immediate market demands of the consumer.
So if the government, and by extension, the military intelligence authorities, believed that a domestic supply of synthetic rubber was critical for national survival in the event of a blockade, it was entirely their responsibility to make it happen.
Exactly.
But how should the government have handled that without just seizing the factories and destroying the market system?
Well, the government had plenty of tools available within a market framework. They could have heavily subsidized the domestic chemical plants directly, ensuring they didn't operate at a loss.
Or, I guess they could have raised tariffs on imported natural rubber to such a punitive level that domestic synthetic rubber suddenly became the cheaper, profitable option for entrepreneurs to produce.
But crucially, either of those options means the public would have to visibly pay the cost for that defense measure through taxes or higher prices. The state failed to enact those policies.
Yeah.
If a nation fails to prepare for an attack, the guilt rests entirely with the government and the voters who elected them, not with the profit-seeking enterprises who were simply following orders from the consumer.
That is a fascinating separation of duties. The market is an engine for managing efficiency and satisfying immediate consumer desires, and the government is an engine for managing defense, justice, and non-market goods.
And when you mix the two inappropriately, you get chaos.
You really do.
Oh.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize this entire journey, bureaucracy isn't some shadowy evil conspiracy designed to ruin your afternoon at the DMV.
No, it's not.
It is a completely necessary structural management tool for things that operate outside the realm of market prices, like courts, police, and national defense.
But when bureaucracy starts creeping into the production of everyday goods, dictating the price of razor blades and paper napkins, it's usually because we, the voters and the government, have tried to bypass the profit motive and consumer choice.
And when we see huge private corporations bogged down in endless red tape, it's often because government interventions, like massive income taxes, have successfully insulated those established giants from the threat of new, innovative competitors.
This raises an important question for how we view the world around us. The next time you are profoundly frustrated by an endless administrative form, or you find yourself stuck dealing with a massive, unresponsive corporation, ask yourself, are you really mad at the clerk behind the desk?
Or are you witnessing the result of a system, either a public agency operating without prices or a protected corporate monopoly that has successfully insulated itself from your daily pennies and your consumer votes?
It completely reframes that anger. Instead of just hating the visible symptom, you start looking for the structural cause behind the glass.
It really does, and it leaves you with a final thought to mull over. If every single penny you spend is a literal vote in a massive, ruthless economic democracy, how many of those votes do you cast blindly on autopilot every day? And how much power do you actually hold to change the landscape of the market simply by changing where you put your spare change tomorrow?